I was sitting alone in my cramped basement apartment in Scarborough, watching the snow fall outside the tiny window, when I realized I had exactly $47 left in my checking account. My greedy daughter and her husband had been treating me like garbage for 6 years. And the worst part? They had no idea I was worth over $6 million. Let me tell you how it all started. My name is Robert. I turned 72 last March, and I spent that birthday alone, eating a microwave dinner in this dingy apartment while my daughter and her family celebrated their new hot tub installation across the city. They didn't even call, but I'm getting ahead of myself. For 43 years, I worked as a structural engineer for one of the largest construction firms in Ontario. I helped design bridges, office towers, and infrastructure projects across the country. My wife, Eleanor, and I lived modestly in a nice house in North York, raised our daughter, Jessica, and quietly built our wealth through smart investments and real estate. Eleanor was the financial genius in our family. While I was out designing buildings, she was studying the stock market, buying rental properties, and building a portfolio that would make most financial advisors jealous. We never flaunted our money. We drove used cars, shopped at No Frills, and lived well below our means. When Jessica was growing up, she had everything she needed, but not everything she wanted. We paid for her university education at Western, helped her get started in her career, and taught her the value of hard work, or so we thought. Everything changed when she met Mark. Mark came from old money in Oakville. His family owned a chain of car dealerships across the GTA, and he grew up expecting the world to be handed to him on a silver platter. When Jessica brought him home for Thanksgiving dinner in 2015, I knew immediately that something was off. He looked around our modest home with barely concealed disdain. When Eleanor served her famous tourtière, he pushed it around his plate and asked if we had anything lighter, maybe some salmon or something. He spent most of dinner talking about his father's business, his plans to expand into luxury vehicles, and the vacation property they were building in Muskoka. Eleanor squeezed my hand under the table. We both saw it. Our daughter was absolutely smitten with this man, and he was absolutely smitten with the idea of himself. They got married the following year in an extravagant ceremony that Mark's family insisted on paying for. The wedding was held at a vineyard in Niagara-on-the-Lake, with 300 guests, a 12-piece orchestra, and enough flowers to fill a botanical garden. Eleanor and I sat at our table, watching our daughter dance with her new husband, and I remember Eleanor whispering to me, "I hope she knows what she's getting into." She didn't. The first few years of their marriage seemed fine on the surface. Mark took over managing one of his father's dealerships. Jessica got a job in marketing at a tech company downtown, and they bought a beautiful house in Leaside. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a finished basement, and a backyard big enough for the golden retriever they adopted. They seemed happy. Or at least, that's what we told ourselves. Then Eleanor got sick. It started with headaches in the spring of 2018. By summer, we had a diagnosis: glioblastoma. The doctors gave her 12 to 18 months. She made it 14. Those 14 months were the hardest of my life. I took early retirement to care for her full-time. We went through her bucket list together, visiting places we'd always talked about but never made time for. We drove across Newfoundland, spent a week in Quebec City, and took the train through the Rockies to Vancouver. But we also spent those months planning. Eleanor, ever the strategist, knew exactly what would happen after she was gone. She'd seen the way Mark looked at us, the way he calculated our worth every time he visited. She'd noticed how Jessica had started asking subtle questions about our finances, our investments, our plans for the future. "They think we're poor," Eleanor said to me one night, about 3 months before she passed. We were sitting on our back deck, wrapped in blankets, watching the stars. "They look at this house, our cars, our clothes, and they assume we have nothing. Maybe that's for the best," I said. She turned to look at me, and even with the cancer ravaging her body, her eyes were still sharp. "Robert, I want you to promise me something. Anything. Don't let them take advantage of you. After I'm gone, they're going to try. Mark especially. He's going to see you as an opportunity, a burden to be managed and an estate to be claimed." "Eleanor, Jessica is our daughter? She would never... She's changed, Eleanor interrupted. You know she has. The money, the lifestyle, Mark's influence. She's not the girl we raised anymore. Promise me you'll protect yourself. Promise me you'll test them before you give them anything. I promised. Eleanor passed away on a Tuesday morning in November 2019. She went peacefully, holding my hand, with the first snow of the season falling outside our window. The funeral was beautiful, filled with friends and family who genuinely loved her. Even Mark managed to look appropriately solemn, though I caught him checking his phone during the eulogy. After the funeral, the questions started almost immediately. Dad, have you thought about what you're going to do with the house? Jessica asked, 3 days after we buried her mother. It's so big for just one person. Maybe you should sell it, downsize to something more manageable. Your mother and I lived here for 38 years, I said. I'm not ready to think about that yet. Mark chimed in, putting his arm around Jessica with practiced concern. We're just worried about you, Robert. Managing a property this size, the maintenance, the utilities, it must be overwhelming. And with Eleanor handling all the finances, you must be pretty lost. There it was. The assumption. Because Eleanor paid the bills and managed our investments, they assumed I knew nothing about our finances. They thought I was a helpless old man who couldn't balance a checkbook. I let them believe it. You're right, I said, letting my shoulders slump. I don't even know where to start. Eleanor handled everything. Jessica and Mark exchanged a look. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but I caught it. Excitement, opportunity. Well, we can help with that, Mark said, his voice dripping with false kindness. I deal with finances all day at the dealership. Why don't you let me take a look at things, help you get organized? That would be wonderful, I lied. I don't know what I'd do without you. Over the next few weeks, Mark made a show of helping me sort through our finances. He asked question after question about our accounts, our investments, our debts. I gave him just enough information to satisfy his curiosity while hiding the truth. You see, what Mark didn't know was that Eleanor and I had restructured everything years ago. Our primary checking account, the one connected to the house expenses and utilities, held a modest amount. Our credit cards had reasonable limits. Our visible assets were exactly what you'd expect from a retired engineer and his wife living in an older home in North York. But hidden beneath that surface was everything else. The investment portfolio, worth $3.2 million, managed through a private wealth firm downtown. The 3 rental properties in Hamilton that generated passive income. The commercial property in Mississauga that we'd bought in the 80s, when the area was still farmland, now worth well over $1 million on its own. And most importantly, the house in Leaside. The one Jessica and Mark lived in. The one they thought they'd purchased 5 years ago. They hadn't purchased it, not really. When Jessica and Mark were looking for their first home, they'd complained endlessly about Toronto's housing market. They wanted something in a good neighborhood, something with space, something that would impress Mark's family. But the prices were astronomical, and even with Mark's salary and Jessica's income, they couldn't afford what they wanted. Eleanor came up with the solution. We would buy the house ourselves, through a numbered company we'd set up years earlier for our rental properties. Then we'd sell it to Jessica and Mark at a significantly reduced price, with a private mortgage arrangement that was far more generous than anything a bank would offer. On paper, it looked like they owned the house. They made monthly payments. They paid the property taxes. They handled the maintenance. But the mortgage was held by our numbered company, and the terms included a clause that neither of them had bothered to read carefully. A clause that stated if any payment was missed, or if certain conditions weren't met, the entire arrangement could be dissolved, and ownership would revert to the holding company. In other words, to me, Eleanor had insisted on that clause. Insurance, she called it, just in case. Now, sitting in Mark's home office as he pored over my bank statements with barely concealed disappointment, I understood why. Robert, Mark said, leaning back in his leather chair, I have to be honest with you. Things aren't looking great here. What do you mean? Well, your pension is modest. Your savings are minimal. And with the cost of maintaining that house, property taxes, utilities, food, You're going to run out of money within a few years. This was, of course, complete nonsense. My pension from the engineering firm was quite comfortable, and my government benefits covered most of my basic needs. But Mark had only seen what I wanted him to see. What should I do? I asked, playing the confused old man to perfection. Mark stroked his chin thoughtfully, the picture of a concerned son-in-law wrestling with a difficult problem. Well, I think the smartest thing would be to sell the house. You could use the proceeds to fund your retirement. Maybe move into something smaller, an apartment, or even, he paused, as if the idea had just occurred to him, you could move in with us. We have that spare room in the basement. It would save you a fortune, and we could keep an eye on you. Keep an eye on me, control me, wait for me to die, and inherit whatever was left. I pretended to consider it. That's very generous, Mark. Let me think about it. I thought about it for exactly 3 days before agreeing to sell my house and move in with them. The sale went through quickly. Toronto real estate being what it is, we had multiple offers within a week and closed within a month. After paying off the remaining mortgage and covering closing costs, I walked away with just over $300,000. Or at least, that's what Jessica and Mark believed. In reality, I transferred the majority of the proceeds directly into my investment portfolio, keeping only enough in my visible accounts to maintain the illusion of modest means. I packed up my belongings, said goodbye to the home where Eleanor and I had built our life together, and moved into the basement of my daughter's house. The spare room they'd offered was exactly what you'd expect. 8 feet by 10 feet, with a small window near the ceiling that looked out at ground level onto their backyard. There was room for a single bed, a small dresser, and not much else. The walls were unfinished concrete, painted a depressing shade of gray. The floor was cold laminate. I know it's not much, Jessica said as she showed me the room, but we'll make it comfortable for you, and you'll have full access to the rest of the house, of course. Full access lasted approximately 2 weeks. The first restriction came when Mark complained about me using the main bathroom during his morning routine. Would you mind using the powder room on the main floor, Robert? It's just that I have a very specific schedule, and I can't be late for work. Then it was the kitchen. Dad, Mark and I usually eat around 7. Would you mind having your dinner earlier? It's just that we need some couple time, you know. Then it was the living room. Robert, we're having some friends over on Saturday. Would you mind staying downstairs? It's just that, well, they don't really know our living situation, and we'd rather not have to explain. Little by little, I was pushed to the margins of their home. My home, technically, though they didn't know it. I ate my meals alone in the basement, watching television on a small screen Jessica had dug out of storage. I used the cramped powder room near the garage. I stayed out of sight when they had visitors, which was often, and I documented everything. Every slight, every restriction, every condescending comment. I wrote it all down in a notebook I kept hidden in my dresser. I wasn't sure why at the time. Maybe I hoped things would get better. Maybe I needed proof to convince myself that this was really happening. It got worse. 6 months after I moved in, Mark lost his job at the dealership. His father, it turned out, had finally gotten fed up with his entitled attitude and constant excuses. The car market was struggling. COVID had just hit, and there was no room for dead weight. Mark was out. You might think this would humble him. It didn't. Instead, he became more aggressive, more demanding, and more resentful. And since he couldn't take his frustration out on his father, he took it out on me. Robert, the utility bills are through the roof this month. Are you leaving lights on down there? Dad, Mark noticed that you've been using a lot of data. We might have to put you on a separate plan. Robert, we need to talk about your contribution to the household. You're living here for free, eating our food, using our electricity. Don't you think it's time you started pulling your weight? Pulling my weight. I was 70 years old, grieving my wife, living in a basement, and they wanted me to pay rent. I offered to contribute $300 a month. They accepted immediately, which told me they'd been hoping for more. That $300 came out of my visible pension account, further cementing their belief that I was barely scraping by. The pandemic made everything worse. With Mark home all day, unemployed and increasingly bitter, there was no escape from his presence. He complained about everything: the economy, The government, the restrictions, his former employers, his ungrateful family. He drank more. He yelled more. He blamed everyone but himself for his failures. Jessica, to my disappointment, enabled every bit of it. "Mark's going through a hard time right now," she would say whenever I tried to talk to her. "You have to be patient with him." Patient. I had been patient for 2 years. I had watched my daughter transform into someone I barely recognized. The sweet, ambitious girl who had graduated at the top of her class, who had dreams of making a difference in the world, was gone. In her place was a woman who lived for status updates, who measured her worth by the brand of her handbag, who had adopted her husband's contempt for anyone who couldn't contribute to their lifestyle, including her own father. The real breaking point came in February of 2022. Toronto was locked in one of those brutal cold snaps that make you question why anyone lives this far north. The temperature had dropped to -25 with the wind chill, and the snow was piling up faster than the plows could clear it. I had been fighting a cold for a few days, nothing serious, but enough that I felt miserable. I'd used the last of my cold medicine and needed to pick up more from the pharmacy. When I came upstairs to ask Jessica if she could drive me, I found her and Mark in the kitchen, huddled over Mark's laptop. "What do you mean we're 3 months behind?" Jessica was saying, her voice tight with panic. "I mean what I said," Mark snapped. "The mortgage payments. We're behind." The bank sent a notice. My ears perked up at this. The mortgage payments. To my holding company. The payments they thought were going to a bank, but were actually being deposited into an account I controlled. I knew they'd been struggling since Mark lost his job. Jessica's salary alone wasn't enough to cover their lifestyle, and Mark had been too proud to take a lesser position anywhere else. But I hadn't realized they'd fallen this far behind. I stepped into the kitchen, clearing my throat. "Is everything all right?" They both turned to look at me with matching expressions of irritation. "We're fine, Dad," Jessica said. "Just some financial stuff. Nothing for you to worry about." "Actually," I said, keeping my voice gentle, "I couldn't help but overhear. If you're having trouble with the mortgage, maybe I could help." Mark let out a sharp laugh. "Help? With what, Robert? Your $300 a month barely covers the hot water you use." I ignored the insult. "I have some savings. Not much, but perhaps enough to get you caught up. I could lend you. Maybe $10,000? It was a test, and they failed it spectacularly. Jessica's eyes went wide. "You have $10,000? I thought you were broke. Why have you been holding out on us?" I wasn't holding out. "It's my emergency fund. But if you need it—" "We don't need your charity," Mark interrupted, his face flushing red. "If you had money this whole time, why have you been mooching off us? Living in our house, eating our food, paying barely anything in rent? I've been contributing what I can." "Contributing?" Mark stood up, knocking his chair back. "You've been a burden since the day you moved in. A useless old man taking up space and resources. And now you tell us you've been sitting on $10,000 this whole time?" "Mark," Jessica said, but there was no conviction in her voice. She wasn't defending me, she was just worried about appearances. "No, I'm done being polite about this," Mark continued. "Robert, you need to give us that money. Consider it back rent for the past 2 years. You owe us that much." I stood there, looking at this man who had married my daughter, who had helped transform her into someone I didn't recognize, who had been bleeding me dry while treating me like dirt. And I made a decision. "No," I said quietly. "I don't think I will." The silence that followed was deafening. Mark's face went from red to purple. Jessica's mouth dropped open. This wasn't how the script was supposed to go. The helpless old man was supposed to cave, to hand over whatever he had, to be grateful for their tolerance. "What did you just say to me?" Mark's voice was low. "Dangerous." I said no. "That money is mine, and I'm not giving it to you." Mark moved faster than I expected. One moment he was standing by the table, the next he was in my face, grabbing the front of my sweater with both fists. "Listen to me, you old parasite," he hissed. "You're going to give us that money, or you're going to find yourself out on the street. How would you like that? -25 outside, nowhere to go, nothing but the clothes on your back? Mark, let go of him." Jessica finally found her voice, but she made no move to physically intervene. Mark released me with a shove that sent me stumbling back against the counter. He straightened his shirt, composing himself with visible effort. "You have until tomorrow morning to make the right decision, Robert. $10,000 in our account, or you're gone." He stormed out of the kitchen. A moment later, I heard the front door slam. Jessica stood frozen, looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. "Dad, she started, then stopped, shook her head. "You should probably just give him the money. It's not worth fighting over." "Jessica, he just assaulted me. He's under a lot of stress. You have to understand." "No," I said, and there was steel in my voice now. "I don't have to understand. I've been understanding for 2 years. I've been patient. I've been accommodating. I've stayed out of your way and asked for nothing. And this is how I'm treated? This is what my daughter has become?" Jessica's face hardened. "What I've become? I've become someone who has to deal with a deadbeat husband and a dependent father while trying to keep a roof over all our heads. Do you have any idea how hard that is? Do you have any idea what I've sacrificed?" "What you've sacrificed?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "I sold my home. I gave you everything I was supposed to have. I've lived in a basement for 2 years, treated like a burden, a charity case, while you and Mark spent money on hot tubs and trips to Mexico, and we deserve those things. We work hard. Mark hasn't worked in 2 years. He's between opportunities. God, you sound just like his father. You don't understand the kind of pressure he's under." I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and I saw a stranger. The girl who had been so proud of her academic achievements, who had volunteered at shelters during university, who had once told me she wanted to make the world a better place. That girl was gone. In her place was someone who had chosen comfort over character, status over substance, loyalty to an abusive husband over love for her father. Eleanor had been right. She'd seen this coming long before I did. "I'm going to my room," I said quietly. "I'll have my decision for you in the morning." I spent that night lying awake in my basement room, listening to the wind howl outside and the radiator clank its inadequate attempts at warmth. I thought about Eleanor, about the promise I'd made her, about the test I'd been conducting for 2 years. They had failed. Completely, utterly, spectacularly failed. But the test wasn't over yet. The next morning, I emerged from the basement at 7 o'clock to find Mark and Jessica waiting in the kitchen. Mark looked smug, confident that a night of reflection had brought me to my senses. Jessica looked tired and anxious, unwilling to meet my eyes. "Well?" Mark demanded. "Have you made the right decision?" I took a deep breath. "I have." "Good. Transfer the money this morning, and we'll forget this whole unpleasantness." "I'm not giving you the money, Mark." His face darkened instantly. "Then we had a deal. Get out." Mark Jessica started. "No," we agreed. "If he won't contribute, he's gone. I'm done supporting this ungrateful old man." I nodded slowly. "All right, I'll pack my things." It took me less than an hour to gather my belongings. Everything I owned fit into 2 suitcases and a box. As I carried them up from the basement for the last time, neither Mark nor Jessica offered to help. At the front door, I paused and turned to look at them. Jessica was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face, but she made no move to stop me. Mark stood with his arms crossed, jaw set, victorious. "Jessica," I said, "I want you to know that I love you. I have always loved you. Nothing that's happened here changes that. But your mother and I raised you better than this. I hope someday you'll remember that." "Dad, please," she whispered. "Just give him the money. It doesn't have to be like this." "Yes," I said. "It does." I walked out into the bitter cold, carrying everything I owned, and didn't look back. What happened next took approximately 3 weeks to execute. I checked into a hotel downtown, a modest but comfortable place near Union Station. I spent the first few days simply recovering, warming up, eating proper meals, sleeping in a comfortable bed without the constant anxiety of walking on eggshells. Then I got to work. First, I called my lawyer. Michelle Wong had been handling my affairs for 15 years, ever since Eleanor had found her through a recommendation from a colleague. She was discreet, efficient, and absolutely ruthless when the situation called for it. Michelle, it's Robert Chambers. I need to discuss the Leaside property. Mr. Chambers, good to hear from you. Is everything all right? I told her what had happened. All of it. The 2 years of mistreatment, the escalating demands, the assault, the eviction. She listened without interruption, occasionally making notes. When I finished, there was a long pause. Robert, I'm so sorry. Eleanor always worried something like this might happen. She made sure we had options. What kind of options? Well, as you know, the mortgage agreement included provisions for exactly this situation. Jessica and Mark have missed 3 consecutive payments, which triggers the default clause. Additionally, the terms stipulated that you were to be provided with adequate living quarters in the property as a condition of the agreement. By evicting you, they've violated that condition as well. What does that mean, practically speaking? It means we have grounds to dissolve the agreement immediately. Ownership of the property reverts to your holding company, effectively to you. I let that sink in. The house they thought they owned, the house they'd just thrown me out of, it was mine. What about their equity? They've been making payments for years. The payments have been going toward interest and property taxes, as per the agreement. There's minimal principal reduction. And given their default status, any equity accumulated would be forfeited under the terms they signed. They'll claim they didn't understand what they were signing. They were advised to seek independent legal counsel before signing. They declined. We have that in writing. I took a deep breath. Do it. Start the process. I'll file the paperwork today. They'll receive notice within the week. The next call was to my financial advisor, Benjamin Murray, at the wealth management firm downtown. I'd spoken to him rarely over the years, preferring to let Eleanor handle the investments. But I knew enough to understand my situation. Mr. Chambers, wonderful to hear from you. How can I help? Benjamin, I need a current assessment of my portfolio. Everything. The investments, the rental properties, all of it. Of course. Give me just a moment to pull up your file. I heard keyboard clicks in the background. Here we are. As of last month's statement, your total investment portfolio stands at approximately $3.4 million. The rental properties in Hamilton are currently valued at a combined $1.8 million, with a total monthly rental income of about $6,200. The commercial property in Mississauga is valued at $1.3 million. And of course, there's the Leaside property, which I understand is currently in transition. What's the Leaside property worth in today's market? Given the neighborhood and the current state of Toronto real estate, I'd estimate between $2 and $2.3 million. I did the math in my head. Altogether, I was worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $8 million. $8 million. And my daughter had thrown me out into the cold for refusing to give her $10,000. The irony was exquisite. Benjamin, I want to make some changes to my estate planning. Can we schedule a meeting? Absolutely. How does Friday look? On Friday, I sat in Benjamin's office and restructured my entire estate. I established a charitable foundation in Eleanor's name, dedicated to supporting education and healthcare initiatives in underserved communities. 60% of my estate would go to the foundation upon my death. 20% would be divided among various family members and friends who had shown me genuine kindness over the years. The remaining 20% was earmarked for a trust for any grandchildren I might have, accessible only after they completed their education and demonstrated a commitment to meaningful work. Jessica's inheritance? 0. Unless and until she demonstrated genuine remorse and a complete transformation of character, she would receive nothing. Was I being petty? Perhaps. But I was also being true to the values Eleanor and I had built our lives around. We hadn't accumulated wealth for the sake of accumulation. We'd done it to provide security, to create opportunity, to make a difference in the world, not to enable entitlement and cruelty. The notice of default arrived at the Leaside house exactly 1 week after I'd been evicted. I wasn't there to see it, of course, but Michelle kept me informed. Apparently, Mark had called her office in a screaming rage, demanding to know what was going on, threatening legal action, accusing us of fraud. Michelle calmly explained the situation, the missed payments, the violated conditions, the terms they'd signed. She offered them 30 days to vacate the property. The next call came from Jessica. "Dad, what is this? What have you done?" I was sitting in my hotel room, looking out at the CN Tower in the distance. "I've exercised my rights under our agreement, Jessica. The same agreement you signed 6 years ago." "Agreement? What agreement? We bought this house." "No, you didn't. You purchased it from a numbered company that Eleanor and I owned. The mortgage was held by that same company. You've defaulted on the payments, and you violated the terms by evicting me. The property reverts to my ownership." "That's impossible." "We would have known. You were given the opportunity to have a lawyer review the documents. You declined. You were so eager to get into the house, so confident that nothing could go wrong, that you didn't bother to read what you were signing." There was a long silence. When Jessica spoke again, her voice was smaller, younger somehow. "Daddy, please. We can't lose this house. Where will we go?" "That's not my concern anymore, Jessica. You made that very clear when you stood by and watched your husband assault me, then allowed him to throw me out into the cold. I'm sorry about that. I really am." Mark was stressed, and he grabbed me by the shirt and threatened me. "You did nothing." I know, and I'm sorry. But please, can't we work something out? This is our home." "It was never your home, Jessica. It was a gift, one that you and Mark clearly didn't appreciate. We'll make up the payments. We'll pay you back everything, with interest. It's too late for that. The decision has been made." "What about all the money we put into this house? The improvements, the maintenance, read the agreement. Any improvements made to the property become part of the property upon reversion." Another silence. I could hear her breathing, could almost feel her desperation through the phone. Part of me wanted to relent, to give in, to find some way to make this right. But then I remembered Mark's hands on my shirt, the contempt in his eyes, the way Jessica had stood by and done nothing. "Jessica, I'm going to say something, and I want you to really listen. Your mother and I spent our entire lives building something. Not just wealth, but values, character, a legacy of kindness and hard work, and treating people with dignity. We tried to pass those values on to you, and for a long time, I thought we had succeeded. Dad, let me finish. Somewhere along the way, you lost sight of those values. Maybe it was Mark's influence. Maybe it was the lifestyle. Maybe it was something else entirely. But the daughter I raised would never have treated anyone the way you've treated me. The daughter I raised would have defended her father against abuse. The daughter I raised would have been horrified at the thought of throwing an elderly parent out into the cold for refusing to hand over money." Jessica was crying now. I could hear her sobs through the phone, and despite everything, it broke my heart. "I still love you, Jessica. I always will. But love doesn't mean enabling bad behavior. Your mother understood that better than anyone. She's the one who insisted on the clauses in the agreement. She's the one who warned me this might happen. I didn't want to believe her, but she was right." Mom knew? Mom knew about all of this? "Your mother knew you better than you know yourself. She saw what was happening to you, saw the person you were becoming. She hoped you would change. We both did, but you didn't. So what happens now? We just lose everything? We end up on the street? You have 30 days to find a new place to live. After that, yes, you'll need to leave the house. What you do after that is up to you. And Mark's debts, the bills, we're drowning here, Dad. Then maybe it's time to stop trying to live like millionaires when you're not. Maybe it's time for Mark to swallow his pride and get a job, any job, instead of waiting for something that meets his standards. Maybe it's time for both of you to learn that actions have consequences. This is revenge. That's all this is. You're punishing us. I considered that, maybe. Or maybe I'm just finally holding you accountable for how you've treated me. Call it whatever you want, Jessica. But this conversation is over." I hung up before she could respond. The next few weeks were a flurry of activity. Michelle handled the legal proceedings with her usual efficiency. Mark tried to fight the eviction, hiring a lawyer of his own. But the documentation was airtight. They had missed payments, they had violated terms, and they had signed away any recourse. The judge ruled in our favor without hesitation. I used part of the time to find a new place to live. Not a basement apartment, not a hotel room, but a beautiful penthouse condo in Yorkville. 2 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a doorman, and a rooftop terrace. The kind of place I never would have allowed myself while Eleanor was alive, but which now felt like exactly what I deserved. I furnished it with comfortable pieces, filled the kitchen with good food, and hung photos of Eleanor in every room. For the first time in years, I felt at peace. On the day Mark and Jessica were scheduled to move out of the Leaside house, I drove by. I didn't stop, didn't make my presence known. I just wanted to see. They were loading a rental truck with boxes, their beautiful furniture looking shabby and diminished in the gray light of a March morning. Mark was barking orders at the movers, his face tight with anger. Jessica was carrying boxes out to the truck, her movements mechanical, her eyes red from crying. For a moment, just a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. This was my daughter, my only child. The baby Eleanor and I had brought home from the hospital 39 years ago. The little girl who used to climb into my lap and beg for stories. The teenager who had made us so proud at her graduation. But then I remembered everything else. The years of disrespect, the gradual dehumanization, the assault, the eviction. I remembered Eleanor's words, her warning, her insistence that I protect myself. I drove on. The house sold 3 months later for $2.3 million. After legal fees and other expenses, the proceeds went directly into the Eleanor Chambers Foundation. The first grants, supporting scholarship programs for underprivileged students across Ontario, were awarded that fall. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Mark and Jessica had moved into a small rental apartment in Etobicoke. Mark eventually took a job selling used cars at a small dealership, a far cry from the luxury vehicle empire he'd once imagined running. Jessica was still working at her tech company, but the stress had taken its toll. They were struggling, I was told, but surviving. Part of me wondered if I should reach out, offer some kind of olive branch, try to rebuild the relationship. But every time I considered it, I remembered Mark's hands on my shirt, Jessica's tears that weren't for me, but for the house. The 2 years of living in that basement, being treated like an afterthought, a burden, a problem to be managed. No, some bridges, once burned, cannot be rebuilt. Some lessons can only be learned the hard way. On the anniversary of Eleanor's death, I visited her grave at Mount Pleasant Cemetery. I told her everything: the eviction, the reveal, the lawsuit, the foundation in her name. I told her about my new apartment, about the peace I'd found, about the life I was building in her absence. "You were right," I said, placing fresh flowers on her headstone. "You were right about everything. I just wish you were here to see it." The wind stirred the leaves around me, and for a moment, I could almost hear her voice. Not words, exactly, but a feeling. Approval, pride, love. I stayed until the sun began to set, then made my way home. These days, I live a quiet life. I have breakfast on my terrace when the weather permits, watching the city wake up below me. I read voraciously, all the books I never had time for during my working years. I volunteer at a local literacy program, helping adults learn to read and write. I travel sometimes, visiting places Eleanor and I always talked about, but never made it to. I've made new friends, people my own age, who understand what it's like to navigate this stage of life. We play bridge on Tuesday nights, have dinner parties on weekends, take day trips to Niagara or the Thousand Islands. It's not the life I imagined for myself, but it's a good one. I haven't spoken to Jessica in over a year. She sends occasional emails, updates about her life, careful attempts to rebuild our relationship. I read them, but I don't respond. Maybe someday I will. Maybe someday she'll demonstrate the genuine change that would allow me to trust her again. But not yet. The wounds are still too fresh, the betrayal too deep. What I've learned through all of this is that family isn't just about blood. It's about how you treat each other. It's about respect and kindness and being there when things are hard. Eleanor and I tried to teach Jessica those values, but somewhere along the way, she forgot them. Maybe she'll remember. Maybe she won't. Either way, I've made my peace with it. Last week, I received a letter. Not from Jessica, but from someone unexpected, a young woman named Sophia, the recipient of one of the first Eleanor Chambers Foundation scholarships. She was graduating from the University of Toronto with a degree in social work, and she wanted to thank me and tell me about her plans. She was going to work with at-risk youth in Regent Park, helping kids from difficult backgrounds find their way. She wrote about how the scholarship had changed her life, how she'd been ready to give up on her dreams when the foundation's support had come through. "Your wife must have been an incredible woman," she wrote, "and you must be an incredible man to honor her memory this way. I hope someday I can make even a fraction of the difference you've made in my life." I sat in my apartment, holding that letter, and I cried. Not from sadness, but from something else. Gratitude, maybe. Hope. This is Eleanor's legacy. Not the money, not the properties, not the investments. The lives we're touching, the futures we're changing, the goodness we're putting into the world. And maybe in the end, that's the best revenge of all. Not bitterness, not anger, not destroying the people who hurt you, but building something beautiful out of the ashes of what they took away. If you're watching this, and you're going through something similar, if someone in your life is treating you like less than you deserve, I want you to know something. You have value. You deserve respect. You don't have to accept cruelty just because it comes from family. It took me too long to learn that lesson. I hope it doesn't take you as long. Thank you for listening to my story. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and never forget what you're worth. This is Robert, signing off. Eleanor, wherever you are, I hope I made you proud.